Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whether you are a morning bird or a night owl, we're so very happy that you are joining us on this very special episode of the Richard Watkins Podcast. Like always, we have to give a huge shout out to the folks that make this podcast possible. The Richard Watkins Podcast is a production of the Science Policy Action Network. I know the world is changing. Innovation is playing a bigger role in our lives than ever before. If you have questions, concerns, or how to navigate this rapidly changing world we live in, look no further than the Science Policy Action Network at span-inc.org. That's SPAN-INC.org. Now, with that out of the way, on today's episode of the Richard Watkins Podcast, I'm joined by the Honorable Justice Anita Earls, Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. Justice Earls has built a distinguished legal career spanning civil rights law, public service, and judicial leadership. Prior to her election to the Supreme Court in 2018, she practiced law for over 30 years, founded the Southern Coalition of Social Justice, and served in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Her work has focused on issues related to voting rights, equal protection, and access to justice, areas that continue to shape the legal and political landscape of North Carolina and the nation. In this conversation, we welcome the Honorable Justice Anita Earls. Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Richard Watkins Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. And thanks so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So we have to start with this. How did Anita Earls become the Honorable Justice Anita Earls? Take us all the way back, you know, as a kid, through college, through training. How did you become one of the members of the North Carolina Supreme Court?
Well, actually, the answer is pretty simple. I'm here because the voters of North Carolina voted for me and gave me this opportunity. So I first ran for office in 2018. As you know, North Carolina's Supreme Court is a 7-member court. We are all elected statewide. That means I'm on every ballot in every city and county of North Carolina. And in 2018, I decided that it was important that our court have representation, including someone with a background in civil rights law. So that's really the short answer of why I'm here. And I think the other part of it for me, obviously, is will I get to stay here? We have 8-year terms, and so we have to run for re-election to keep our seat. In 2026, I'll be on the ballot again, and my seat is the only one of the 7 members of our court. In 2026, my seat is the only one on the ballot. So I am actively campaigning and hoping that the voters of this state will see fit to allow me to continue in this role. People may remember the huge controversy in North Carolina over another seat on our court in 2024. Justice Allison Riggs, her seat was the only one on the ballot, and a huge controversy over how whether ballots that were legally cast at the time of the election would be counted. And I think what is so important for people to remember is that she won by 734 votes out of over 5.5 million votes. So incredibly close election. And we also know that in 2020, Governor Cooper appointed Sherry Beasley to be the first African-American woman to be Chief Justice of this court. There was a vacancy because the prior Chief Justice resigned, and Chief Justice Beasley, unfortunately lost by 401 votes, an even smaller and closer margin. She did not seek to throw out anyone's ballots. Once there was a count and a recount, Chief Justice Beasley accepted the results of the election. That's not what happened in 2024. But to get back to I think what you're really asking me is what kind of career do you have in order to be in a position to be a justice. And that, for me personally, I would say that my path to the bench, if you will, my career path has been a little bit unusual because I litigated civil rights cases for 30 years before running for the court. I was initially in a private firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Some people may know that firm. It was Julius Chambers' firm. When I joined it, it was Ferguson, Stein, Wallace, and Adkins. So you might recognize some of those names: James Ferguson, a noted civil rights attorney; Adam Stein, the father of our current governor, a noted civil rights attorney; Mel Watt, who left the firm and went on to be a member of Congress and then headed up the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Just an incredible small firm of these lawyers. Julius Chambers, if you don't know that name, he is the civil rights attorney who argued Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, a major precedent in the area of school desegregation. But he also argued significant cases in pretty much every area of civil rights law. So voting rights, employment discrimination. He argued multiple times in the US Supreme Court. So I was really excited to be able to come to Charlotte straight out of law school. I went to Yale Law School, and it was actually Mel Watt, who also went to Yale Law School and came up to the law school to recruited me basically to come to North Carolina. I wanted to do civil rights work because I grew up in a mixed race family. My father's Black, my mother's white. When they met in the late 1950s in the state of Missouri, it was illegal for them to be married in that state. They moved out to Washington State because in that state, legally, they could get married. But that experience and many others that I saw my family facing barriers to what employment opportunities they might have, what educational opportunities they had, where we could live as a family. We moved from a Black neighborhood to a white neighborhood. We were the only Black family in that neighborhood, and we were immediately made to know that we weren't welcome there. All kinds of barriers that we faced as a family. I felt like being a lawyer might give me an opportunity to try to change some of that. So I knew from a pretty early age that I wanted to be a lawyer and that I wanted to try to really just advance the concept of equal justice under the law. So that's been my career's work. And I was really fortunate to do that work, to do civil rights work and to work for equal justice in quite a wide range of legal practice settings. So I started out in private practice, but as you noted, I was also at the Civil Rights Division in the US Department of Justice. And there I got to see the potential that the federal government had to protect people's rights across the country. And we did that in a very nonpartisan way. So even though I was appointed by President Clinton, I was not acting in a political way. We didn't, when someone came to the Department of Justice and said their rights were being violated, we did not ask, who did you vote for? Or what's your political party? We investigated, are their rights being violated? Similarly, I was at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law for 2.5 years, and actually filed a lawsuit against the state of Florida following the 2000 Bush v. Gore election because of the way that Black voters in particular, but Black and Hispanic voters in Florida were disenfranchised in that election. In other words, they tried to cast ballots and either they were not allowed to vote or their votes were not counted. And again, that was a very nonpartisan effort. We stood for the proposition that our democracy works when every citizen has the right to vote and is able to exercise that right. So that was a great opportunity, again, to work around the country, but I wanted to come back to North Carolina. So in 2003, I went to the UNC Center for Civil Rights. At that time, it was the Julius Chambers Center for Civil Rights. It has since been eliminated by the General Assembly. But while I was there, I was able to work with Julius Chambers again on civil rights cases. And in 2007, I did found the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. The reason I did that was because it seemed important to me to bring a wide range of tools to community-based groups that were trying to improve their communities. So by a wide range of tools, I mean lawyers, researchers, media, so communications, and community organizing. So the staff started out with people from all those professions, if you will, and worked with community groups. And again, a very nonpartisan way. So my career has been about enforcing everyone's rights in a wide variety of settings, and state courts seemed like also an important place to protect our rights. And we might get into this more, but I will just note that people often think about the Bill of Rights in our federal constitution as a protection of our rights, but the state constitution actually starts out the first article of the state constitution is all about individual rights. What individual rights do the citizens of the state have? And there are some rights in the state constitution that don't have any protection under the federal constitution. Most notably, the right to a sound basic education in a uniform system of public education. That's language straight from the state constitution. And it doesn't, there's no amendment to the US Constitution that says we all have a right to be educated. So that's why I think state courts are really important, and I am eager to continue to serve the citizens of the state on the North Carolina Supreme Court.
Yeah, so you talked about the federal level, and I just want to ask a quick question, because folks might not know this, but at the state level Supreme Court, you serve 8-year terms, and then you go up for election, and it's a partisan election, right? So you run as a Democrat or Republican. Is that correct? Is my understanding of that correct?
Yes. Now, it hasn't always been that way, so it's perfectly understandable that people might be confused. In fact, when I ran in 2018, that was the first time Supreme Court races were partisan in some time. Not the first time ever in the history of the state, but the first time for a while. So the Republican legislature passed a law making the seat partisan. In 2016, people may remember that there was again one seat up, and my colleague, Justice Mike Morgan, was on the ballot in 2016. And a really fascinating thing happened. In 2016, so we have a 15-member Court of Appeals. That's kind of the intermediate level where, so all your cases come first from the trial court level. But if you think that the trial court got the law wrong, you have automatically the right to appeal to the Court of Appeals. Those 15 judges decide cases in panels of 3. So 3 judges hear the case. And then if you still think the Court of Appeals got the law wrong, you can ask our court to hear the case. So that's how cases get to us. The Court of Appeals judges are also elected statewide. They also have 8-year terms. But in 2016, they were partisan. So the Court of Appeals races had a D or an R after the name, whereas the Supreme Court was nonpartisan. And if you look at the election returns statewide in that race, close to 500,000 voters skipped over the Supreme Court race, did not vote for either candidate in the Supreme Court race, but voted for Court of Appeals. So that seems to indicate that at least in 2016, voters relied on or wanted the partisan label to help inform them of who the candidates are and what the candidates stand for. The legislature made the Supreme Court partisan in 2018, and they are today. So yes, we run there's a partisan primary if more than one person puts their name up to be on the ballot, and then in the general election, you choose between a Democrat or a Republican.
That's fascinating. So if I understood you correctly, the shift to partisan races has increased voter participation. Like, did I understand that correctly? With that 2016 shift, it increased, at least, I mean, the voters were already participating, but for one reason or another, they were skipping over that because I guess they were like, well, it's not partisan, so I don't need to participate. that's interesting.
It is really fascinating. No one to my knowledge did any polling or other effort to determine why those numbers showed up. All I can tell you is that is what you go to the Board of Elections, look at the election returns, that's what the numbers show. And so yes, more people are voting in the Supreme Court race when there's a partisan label than in 2016 when there was not a partisan label.
That's incredible. And so the U.S. Supreme Court is not a race. You're appointed by the president, then confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Is that, and I just want to understand, like, I guess from your perspective, is that better or worse than having somebody serve for life versus an 8-year term, somebody appointed versus somebody elected? I've always been kind of trying to figure out, what is the better way? Maybe it's better that we have a mixture with North Carolina. Wait, as I'm speaking, more questions are coming into my head. Are there any states who have lifetime judge appointments, judge elections? Are there any states, or is that just the U.S. Supreme Court?
So there are a variety of ways that state Supreme Courts are formulated, and there's a variety of sizes. Like interestingly, for example, South Carolina's Supreme Court is only 5 members, not 7. And the US Supreme Court is 9. So different sizes of courts. And that court is appointed by the legislature. So some state courts are appointed, some have what's called retention elections. So a seat is filled by appointment, and then the voters just get to vote up and down, do we keep that person or not? And when that happens, the data, and this is from a study, I think I'm right from the Brennan Center, but literally 99% of the time in retention elections, the judge who's appointed keeps their seat. Washington State, and so the retention elections might be every 6 years. For example, I think that's Washington State. California also has retention elections. And so I'm not aware of any state Supreme Court that is purely you get appointed and then you serve for life, but I'm not sure. I don't want to speak on that because I just am not sure. But what I do know is that other states have partisan elections, and in the states that are even nominally nonpartisan, the partisanship can clearly be known by everybody. So let me talk about Wisconsin, because we know that in earlier this year, this spring, there was a very high profile state Supreme Court contest. One seat was up in the state of Wisconsin. And even though their seats are nonpartisan, everyone knew who the Democratic supported candidate was and which candidate was supported by the Republican Party. That is the state Supreme Court race where $100 million was spent. It's just like, it boggles my mind. $100 million was spent in that election. That's the election where Elon Musk went out to Wisconsin and was offering voters, he was giving voters money to sign petitions. It was a highly politicized, high profile race. I don't think Elon Musk will be coming to North Carolina in 2026, but I do think that this race for my seat will be the second most contested seat on the ballot, right behind the U.S. Senate seat. We now know that Governor Roy Cooper has announced that he's running as a Democrat for our open Senate seat, or not, yes, open Senate seat, because Senator Tillis has said he's not running again. And I think this seat will be number 2. So I am really hoping that people will take the time to learn about the candidates and understand that these days our politics are impacted by a lot of stuff on social media that's just not true. Especially with the capacity of AI to take my voice and my image and make me be saying anything in the world. So I think it's really important that people Get engaged. I've been going around the state talking to voters. It's actually really hard to get people to come out. I mean, I understand, like, I'm not singing, or, like, I'm not doing a play. Like, there's nothing particularly exciting about coming to hear a candidate speak. I get it. Um, I was in Whiteville, which is in Columbus County, southeastern part of the state, on Monday evening, and about 30 people showed up, some young folks, but it's really important to me to have the chance to meet as many people as I can, because I think if they see me in person and they hear from me directly, then they can make their best assessment of who they want to support and why it matters to them. And I appreciate you doing this podcast, because this is another way, obviously, another way for people to hear from me. But I really encourage folks to recognize that, when an election out of 5.5 million voters is decided by fewer than 1,000 votes, absolutely your vote counts and your voice matters, and it really makes a difference. So I know I've kind of been rambling on, but let me just say why I think it matters so much. I think people don't realize that, first of all, our court makes decisions about so many things that impact your life. Everything from how much you pay for electricity. Our electricity rates are governed by a utilities commission, and our court reviews what that utilities commission does and whether what they have done is consistent with state law. So, if you get that electric bill and you think it's maybe higher than it should be, then our court was the place that was supposed to protect your rights. Obviously, voting rights, whether or not your ballot's going to count. I mentioned education. We are deciding cases that impact whether there will be funding for a sound basic education in North Carolina. So the quality of schools that your children are attending in public schools is impacted by our court. If you're injured on the job, under state law, you have the right to workers' compensation. Our court decides under what circumstances, what do you have to prove to be entitled to compensation? And so whether or not you'll get fairly compensated for an injury that you get on the job, that's something our court decides. We have heard cases about whether or not people who are uninsured and go to an emergency room can sue over charges that the hospital is placing on their bill that insured patients don't have to pay. So a whole bunch of issues affecting healthcare, education, job opportunities, like you name it, we're protecting the environment. We have made decisions that impact the ability of the state to ensure that the people of the state have clean air and clean water. So that's kind of how it's directly impacting you. But there's another way, a slightly indirect way, that our court is making decisions that are affecting what's happening. And that's because of the issues around redistricting. So in 2022, our court said that extreme partisan gerrymandering, so partisan gerrymandering being the practice of drawing election districts, so districts for state house, state senate, Congress, drawing election districts in a way that unfairly favors one party over the other. North Carolina in voting patterns is a very purple state. And the issue is whether or not the districts are drawn in a way that reflects that. So in 2022, we said, if the districts are extremely unfair, extreme partisan gerrymandering, that violates your right to vote. That it's important not only that your vote be counted, but that it carry the same weight as everybody else. And your vote shouldn't count less just because you're a Republican or less just because you're a Democrat. It should count the same. And what do I mean by it doesn't count the same? Well, this is my best example. After we decided that case in 2022, voters sent Republicans to our court instead of Democrats. The court became 5-2, 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And the new court said, they didn't say that the districts aren't extreme gerrymanders. They said, we as a court have no business telling the legislature how to draw their maps. We're not going to enforce that right. So the legislature redrew. In 2023, after the redrawn districts, it resulted in the elections in 2024 being a situation where more people across the state, if you add up just across the state, all the votes, more people voted for Democrats for state house and state senate than Republicans. And yet we see that we have a veto-proof supermajority in the Senate of Republicans and just one vote shy of a supermajority veto-proof majority in the state house Republican again. And that's just an imbalance, right? What we should have a much more balanced legislature. Same thing is true for our congressional delegation. 2022, state Supreme Court said the districts were extreme partisan gerrymanders and required redrawn districts. North Carolina sent 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans to Congress, to the US House of Representatives. New court came into power, said, no, we can't constrain the legislature. New districts were drawn. And after 2024, we sent 4 Democrats and 10 Republicans to Congress. If we still had that 7-7 delegation, right now today, the House of Representatives would be controlled by Democrats. And Hakeem Jeffries would be likely Speaker of the House. And there would be an entirely different check and balance on the power of the executive. So if you don't think it's a good idea that the Department of Education be eliminated, if you're concerned about the incredible restrictions on FEMA funding, that we actually probably should have the federal government helping out in emergency situations after natural disasters, if you're concerned about the way the federal government is completely cutting back on medical research, the way forcing universities like Duke to lay off literally thousands of employees, if what's happening right now in Washington, it has you concerned, you got to remember that it's because our state Supreme Court went into the hands of Republicans that we now have districts that don't fairly reflect the voting patterns. And I'm not talking about voter registration here. I'm talking about how voters actually vote when people go to the polls. If you look at how they actually vote, this is an evenly divided state, and yet our representatives are not evenly divided. So that's a second way in which the state Supreme Court really impacts our state and impacts your ability as a voter to have a voice.
There's just so much to unpack there. I mean, I have a question I wanted to ask next, but one of the things that I am struck by is that, generally speaking, voters are provided with a narrative that all politics is local, and that their primary concerns should be just what's happening in their municipality, just what's happening in their neighborhood. But you're articulating another story, that what you do locally has reverberations that have national implications. And you just laid out some of those things. So when we talk about kind of voting rights, one of the other things I think about, and you're, providing a service right now, is kind of voter education. This kind of concept that, local matters, but also what you do or decide not to do has an impact on the entire country. When you go and you talk to folks, do you feel that people appreciate that? Or do you still feel that people are primarily concerned with what's going on down the road?
I think it's very much a mix. As I said, I've been going around the state, talking to voters at town hall meetings, and some people definitely want to hear about national policy and are extremely upset by what we're seeing with people being snatched off the street by men in masks on no uniforms, innocent folks being put into custody without due process. There are definitely people concerned about that. There are people concerned about our foreign policy, not only what we're doing in the US, but what we're doing abroad. At the same time, absolutely, there are folks that worry about especially in Eastern North Carolina, their hospital being shut down. So that is a local thing, right? If you no longer can get emergency medical assistance 10, 15, 20 minutes from your home, and you've got to go an hour if you have a heart attack, right? People are very concerned about that. And yet that's something that is happening because of a combination of state and federal politics. I think obviously we're in a municipal election year. So the people who are campaigning, who are going to be on the ballot in 2025 are your local elected officials. I do tell people that the further you go down the ballot, the closer you get to your front door. That your local elected officials are really making a difference, but obviously you can't ignore top of the ticket. The other thing I'll tell you is, again, remember, Justice Riggs won by 734 votes. There was a 200,000 vote difference between governor in North Carolina and Supreme Court. So a lot of people, literally hundreds of thousands of people, went to the polls and voted for president and governor, and then turned in their ballot and did not exercise their vote for down ballot. And so I think it is vitally important that people recognize that their voice matters at every level. One of the impacts, I think, of extreme partisan gerrymandering is that the party that doesn't have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, that people get discouraged. So it's not only that, and understand, our court said it's unconstitutional no matter which party does it. This is the rule of law that we're talking about here. We're saying neither party should engage in extreme gerrymandering, right? With computers these days, it's really easy to draw maps that favor one party or the other. And our court said, no, you have to draw fair districts. But if say in a county, for example, that Democrats have no chance of electing state house or state senate representative, their county commission is all Republican. So whether it's at the local level or at these state officers, they just get discouraged. They say, why should I care about voting? My vote isn't going to make a difference. The districts are drawn in a way that's unfair. Part of my message to those voters is, I understand that. I've seen that happen. I know why you're frustrated, trying to do something about it, but understand that for the statewide seats, your vote counts as much as every other voter, right? And you can really make a difference. In our statewide seats are very close. So even if you're in a county, our politics have gotten to the point where it's all about, this is a red county, this is a blue city, whatever, we use those labels. And the truth is that none of those places are that monolithic. There are Democrats in red counties. There are Republicans in blue cities. And for a statewide race, every single vote, wherever you live in the state, counts the same. It is statewide. It can't be redistricted. So please, please, please understand the importance of your vote being heard.
Another question, and this was supposed to be kind of my follow-up question, and it's a naive question. It's, kind of how things work. So you're making decisions on things that impact all North Carolinians, and in fact, impact the entire country in many regards. How does this actually kind of take place? Do the justices get together and then argue and then decide? And part of the responsibility of a justice is to convince other justices of their point of view on a particular case. and maybe that's naive, but I'm just wondering, like, what is that what happens? And like, what does that look like? Are people screaming? Are people, I mean, because some of these issues are just huge. I mean, I'm imagining if there is, arguments, like, yeah, let me just back up. What does that look like? Are you all arguing, trying to convince one another of your points? What does that look like?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think that transparency is an important value for our court. There's a sense in which we are the least transparent branch of government. Your county commission meeting, there's an open meetings law in North Carolina. And by state statute, if your county commission's going to meet and discuss something, they have to do it open with the public there. There's a couple of issues, personnel issues and litigation issues they can go into executive session to discuss. But for the most part, they have to deliberate. They have to talk, debate and deliberate in public. We don't deliberate in public. We have public oral arguments, and those are on YouTube. People may not realize, but you can watch it live, or you can just go onto YouTube and since the pandemic, this wasn't true pre-pandemic, but since the pandemic, all of our arguments are on YouTube. You can go and look so in an oral argument in our court, all 7 of us are there on the bench, unless there's a few cases where someone's recused, and so there'll only be 6 of us. But all of the justices are on the bench. The advocates get 30 minutes aside. And interestingly, the U.S. Supreme Court, you can listen to their arguments, but they don't actually have video of their oral arguments. But we have video, so you can watch us. You can hear the questions we ask. I think that there are times when we are kind of responding to each other on the bench. So that is the closest to public deliberation that you'll see from our court. And I guess the other way we are public is that then you will see our opinions and you'll see the dissents. Sometimes there's a concurring opinion. So a concurring opinion means that someone agrees with the outcome, but would do that for a different reason. And so to that degree, we are public and transparent. We also, interestingly, have begun to make more decisions on a shadow docket. Now, people may have heard of the shadow docket as something that the U.S. Supreme Court increasingly is involved with, and you may have heard Supreme Court justices who are critical of the practice of making very important decisions about, say, what power does the president have, without explaining them. We have had the same process. Most recently in the case involving the State Board of Elections and whether the governor or the state auditor should have the power to appoint the State Board of Elections, we made a decision to allow a law that a 3-judge court had found to be unconstitutional. We allowed it to go forward. I wrote a dissent, but that happened without oral argument in a way that is similar to the U.S. Supreme Court shadow docket. So I hope that there will be more effort for academics and others, people studying courts and the judicial process, to explore the question you asked. How, there's a reason why there's 7 of us, right? When you go to a trial court, you have that honorable accident and you want to get compensated by the person who ran into you. It's a single judge making that decision. But on our court, all 7 of us are involved in the decision making. And I think that different Supreme Courts across the country have different processes for how they consider cases. The California Supreme Court's pretty unique in that they assign a case to a justice before the oral argument, and that justice actually circulates a draft opinion before the argument. I've talked with members of that court who say that they think that really helps them come to consensus, that they have very few dissents. Our court in recent years has had a lot of dissenting opinions, and I after the oral arguments in our court, we go back to a conference room and it's confidential what happens there. what I can say is that I think that it's a little bit like a jury, right? Juries go into the jury room and it's confidential what they say and do back there. But I think that there are ways in which 7 people can deliberate with an open mind, listening to each other, much as you described, hoping to persuade each other, marshaling arguments. And so I think that there's actually some art and skill to being one of 7 and to doing that effectively. But as I said, our deliberations are confidential, so I can't really say more than that at this stage, except that I have thought a lot about what is the best way, because there's voters get to choose who's on our court, and I think it's important to have multiple perspectives. I think that as a 7-member body, we come to the best decision for the people of the state if we represent the state well. And that there's a reason why there's a reason why, a single justice doesn't get to decide a case. So when I think of diversity on our court, I think of it along multiple lines. So diversity in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of practice areas. All of us on this court did something as a lawyer before we came to the court. That's also, not necessary. It's interesting to me that in other countries, some people study to become a judge and start out their careers as judges, like they never practice law. But that's not the case in the US. And so I think it's useful to have former prosecutors. I think it's useful to have former public defenders, both sides of the criminal justice system, right? That it's useful to have someone with civil rights experience, useful to have someone with a business law experience, that we should have multiple folks. And similarly, I think the issue of balance is an important one in my election, because if I lose, our court would be 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And to me, that doesn't represent balance.
Wow. I am so glad that I asked that question. I'm like, whoa, this is incredible. This is absolutely incredible. Um, I want to ask so many other questions just about like the Supreme Court, and technically you're supposed to have 3 equal branches of government, but just the way that politics is marketed, it seems like the executive branch is like the most important, and then the other 2 branches maybe fall underneath that. But that's maybe a conversation for another day. What I would like to ask, and we're kind of going into the part where you're letting us know what you think we should know about, right? So you touched on a lot of policy pieces, you touched on a lot of things in general, but I wanted to kind of focus now on, what do you think that voters should know about? Are there any particular policies that they should be thinking about when thinking about the Supreme Court and thinking about the races, maybe some of which are not top of mind for most people? What are some of those things that, yeah, I'm interested in knowing.
I would put first and foremost that the role of our court is to protect your rights. We swear an oath to uphold the state constitution. And in my mind, that state constitution has some very important fundamental rights for the people of the state. I talked about education, but there are others as well. And the real question, I think, is who has a record of protecting rights and who has not been protecting rights, if you will. You will see a lot of, in the past, our political ads for state Supreme Court have always been about criminal law. Lock them up. Does this judge lock them up? Does this judge let them out? And that is just yes, absolutely. How we rule in criminal cases matters. Public safety matters. And I'm the first one to understand that we need a criminal justice system that is respectful of victims' rights. My family, my brother was murdered, and the person who killed him was never prosecuted. And I understand what that meant to my family. I understand what that meant for our community. And I know that many of our communities, the communities that I worked with at the Southern Coalition, for example, our mission was to serve communities of color and low wealth communities across the state. And I know that it's the people in those communities that are most often the victims of crime. We need great public safety policies. We need a court that will enforce criminal laws. I understand that. But the single-minded focus on a TV ad with someone that everyone would look at and say that's a heinous criminal. There are some horrible crimes that are committed in this state, and it breaks my heart when we have to. We have the death penalty in this state. We have cases in which people have been sentenced to death by a jury, and there's no doubt that those awful things happen and that our courts are a place to deal with them. But that is only a part of what we do. And in fact, we decide about 80 cases a year, and about 20 to 30 of them have been criminal cases. So less than half. So what's all the other stuff we're doing? I would say to you, the other stuff is about protecting your other rights. And that's what I hope people will focus on. And what I can tell you is that you will hear a lot in court campaigns for court, whether my seat or other seats, about the Republicans being constitutional conservatives. That is their phrase. That's what they say they are. Unfortunately, I think as that's been implemented, it means that they will ignore the Constitution if it doesn't align with their conservative policy goals, and education is top of that list, because the state courts that have the responsibility of enforcing the state constitution. I joined an opinion in 2022 in the Leandro case that said, if the legislature won't adequately fund our public schools across the state so that every student has access to a sound basic education in a public school, if the legislature won't fund it, it's the responsibility of the courts. And we ordered that money be spent. But then in actually 2 months after taking off, in March of 2023, our court put a halt to that order. Over a year later, in February 2024, we heard arguments again. And here it is, July of 2025, and our court has not ruled. So that money is still being held up. So I say that my philosophy is that it is our responsibility as a court to enforce all of your rights under the state constitution. And I believe that constitution should be interpreted in light of current conditions and circumstances. You raised the balance of powers and checks and balances, 3 branches of government. That is actually a really important question for our court. And people should know that the constitutional conservatives on our court believe that it is the 1776 Constitution that they should be enforcing. And you got to think about what our state looked like in 1776. Women didn't have the right to vote. People were enslaved in this state, and people of color did not have the right to vote. So a huge difference in society from 1776 to 2025. And, the state enacted a new constitution after the Civil War and revised that constitution in 1967. So it's important to understand that there are very real differences between Republicans and Democrats in terms of their view of what your rights are and how they should be enforced. And that's what I think it's important for people to understand.
Thank you so much. We are coming to the end of the hour. Obviously, you can stay with us all day as long as you want, but you have got a state to serve. So I want to be mindful and respectful of your time. And I will end with this question. And, I think one of the gifts and the curse of being a podcast host is that I have the opportunity to talk to the most brilliant minds in the world, quite frankly. And thank you so much for being a guest, the Honorable Justice Anita Earls. What always happens is that after the interview has concluded, I wish I would have asked this, or I wished I would have asked that. And you perhaps may have been thinking, oh, I wish you would have asked that too. So I want to finish off with this question, and I finish off every interview with the same question, and that is, Honorable Judge Anita Earls, what should I have asked you? What did I miss? And then after you say, yeah, you should have asked this, please proceed with the answer to that question. And that'll wrap up our questioning for today.
Right. No, that's a great last question. I think you should have asked me, how do people get in touch with me if they want to know more? And so I will give that answer. And the answer is my website is earlsforjustice.com. That's EARLS, and then the number 4 or the word 4, Earls for Justice, that's all one word.com. And there you can sign up to get my emails. You can email me at Anita@earlsforjustice.com. So that's how you can learn more information about me. I'm happy to talk to any group about our courts, why they matter. So if there's an event in your community and you would like to see me come and talk in person, please get in touch with me, email me out. I do have a day job. We do have oral arguments and I have opinions to write, but schedule permitting, I would love to get out to communities across the state and just, I think, understand that my commitment is to equal justice under the law. And that might sound like a abstract phrase, but I see what it means every day in the cases that come before us, and that's my commitment. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope that folks will get in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Honorable Justice Anita Earls. Remember, the Richard Watkins Podcast is a production of the Science Policy Action Network. And most importantly, thank you so much for joining us today. And remember this, that the future is not something to wait for. It is something to build. Have a great time. And until next time, stay safe.